It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Well, when Kennedy became president, he inherited a Cold War that had been going for quite a while and that had gotten worse.
At Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin had made agreements about how to cut up Europe at the end of the war.
The British, at the end of World War II, had been providing some economic and military support to the Greek government and the Turkish government, both of which were under some pressure from the Soviet Union. That winter was a terrible winter in Europe, and the British advised the Americans that they could not afford to continue this, asked that the United States assume the obligations that the British had in the Mediterranean. The U.S. government decided to do so. It had also happened in 1946. There had been a congressional election that had created large Republican majorities in both houses under the Democratic President Harry Truman. And the Truman Doctrine was President Truman's assertion that the United States would support any people who were fighting for their freedom. And the administration decided that in order to persuade that Congress to put up the money for aid to Greece and Turkey, they had to scare them.
I am Edward R. Murrow. For a little while, I would like to review with you the great conflict of our times, one which demands and must get the attention and the involvement of each one of us.
So Mr. Truman went before a joint session of Congress and put the issue in terms of a confrontation between forces of good and the forces of evil as relating to the survival of freedom.
All along, it had been only too obvious that ever since World War II, the Soviets had been building their military strength. Their threat of world domination was real, and it was increasing all the time.
Dean Acheson was the Undersecretary of State, and he was the person who sat in the room with Harry Truman and the others and said that it was going to be necessary to make a very strong appeal and put it in terms of black and white in order to get appropriations from Congress. And it was he then who, in testimony before Congress, invoked the equivalent of a domino metaphor. He listed a whole raft of countries that were going to fall if Greece and Turkey were not aided, including India, among others.
The Soviet Union had promised to withdraw from many of the occupied lands, Poland, for instance, and Hungary and all of that. At the end of the war, the Soviet Union did not withdraw. The divisions hardened. Both sides chose up.
A critical crisis was the 1948 crisis over Berlin.
One of the interesting things we've learned from listening to the actual tapes of the meetings during the missile crisis is what John Kennedy thought the crisis was about. He thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was, at its core, about Berlin.
1948, Berlin. Ever since the end of the war, 3 years before, tension had been increasing between the Allied military government and the Soviet bosses of East Berlin. The Cold War was becoming warm.
Soviets tried to shut down Western traffic into the city in complete violation of all the four-power agreements.
The occupation personnel of the Western nations, both military and civilian, along with the 2.5 million of the German population, were threatened with starvation. With all the arteries into the city closed, Berlin was paralyzed.
The West decided to resist that and to supply the city by an airlift.
In late June 1948, General Curtis LeMay, commanding general of the U.S. Air Forces in Europe, started the airlift.
The United States and the Western Allies airlifted material, coal, heating fuel into Berlin and broke the Soviet blockade.
It was touch and go, and it could well have been given up, but the people of Berlin really rallied to the Western side, and it could not be given up after that point. You had 2 million people who had basically put their lives on the line there, and that remained the case and was responsible for an enduring American commitment in Europe.
The United States now felt that communism was the enemy, not just Stalin, not just the Soviet Union, but if this is what that system produced, we had to oppose communism. Here at home, we began to try to root out the communists. We sent communist leaders to jail because of their political beliefs. This picture then now painted a world which was absolutely divided.
The real problem is the Soviet desire to expand their power and influence. If Mr. Khrushchev would concern himself with the real interests of the people of the Soviet Union, there's no real reason why the United States and the Soviet Union, separated by so many thousands of miles of land and water, both rich countries, both with very energetic people, should not be able to live in peace.
The Cold War was the overleaf of everything. People planned their lives around it. We built bomb shelters in the United States in the early 60s, not just for large populations, but for individuals. People in their backyard would build a bomb shelter like people build a swimming pool.
When I was at school and we taught all this civil defense, but we joked, they told that if it will be the nuclear explosion, then you have to cover yourself with the blanket, something white, and we joke then slowly move towards cemetery. And they ask why slowly, because you mustn't create the panic.
Then you get in the 1950s the development of the nuclear arms competition.
The Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb, and then, before Stalin's death, exploded its first hydrogen bomb.
It was in this decade of the 1950s that missiles were brought into the family of weapons of aerospace warfare.
So by the 50s, people in both countries, I think, were persuaded that a World War III was coming. As the guided missiles that were intercontinental were perfected, as the armies took sides across that Iron Curtain in Europe, it was thought that we would inevitably have the kind of flashpoint in conflict that would cause war.
And here sits Berlin, surrounded by Soviet troops.
We all knew that Khrushchev was getting increasingly agitated about Berlin, which for Nikita Khrushchev was the bone in my throat.
Kennedy's one and only direct personal meeting with Nikita Khrushchev was in Vienna in June 1961.
The Vienna summit was composed of two meetings, one at the American embassy and one at the Russian embassy.
Imagine the scene. Is a new president, a young man, a child of wealth. He's meeting Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Khrushchev has been at the top of a brutal leadership of the Soviet Union for decades. And here Khrushchev now meets Kennedy. Khrushchev, you know, from his humble beginnings.
His impression was positive.
President Kennedy, as the host, naturally stood up when Khrushchev walked into the room to shake his hand. I learned later from Khrushchev's interpreter that Khrushchev regarded the fact that an American president stood up when he, Khrushchev, walked into a room as a sign that the Soviet Union had arrived.
My father thought that Kennedy is different than Eisenhower, because President Eisenhower was an experienced person who wanted to prevent the war, but from my father's opinion, he was not a politician. He told, when I'm talking with him, I really don't know who is making decision and with whom I have to talk. And about Kennedy, he told that from the very beginning it was clear that it is just this man control the foreign policy. And he think that because he's American president, he can press Soviet Union. And he told, we'll show him that we're also a great country. He defend his system, we defend our system, and we have to be treated as equals.
Khrushchev is brutal with Kennedy, insisting that he's going to bring this Berlin problem to a climax one way or another, and clearly threatening the possibility of war. Kennedy had come into that meeting wanting to have a serious discussion that could bridge common differences, and Khrushchev almost seemed to be bullying him.
He had no intention to start the war or to use the force. He told why we have to use the force to bring better life to Americans. If they will want to join us, they will elect communists as the president. and they will be with us. We mustn't sacrifice our lives for their better life.
The experience had a tremendous effect on Kennedy. Kennedy's concern that Khrushchev's underestimating him, his concern that the Cold War was becoming so dangerous. What's more subtle is, what did Khrushchev take away from this encounter? And I fear the evidence is that Khrushchev took away from this encounter that maybe Kennedy is a man who can be bullied.
That was in his mind, that somehow or another Kennedy could be taken.
He underestimated Kennedy.
And when they broke up after that meeting, Kennedy, sensing this, turned to him and said, "It's going to be a cold winter." And of course, the first thing Kennedy did when he left Vienna, he flew to London that night, was to announce that there would be a buildup of American armed strength in West Berlin.
At any moment they could take it over. And the only defense for Berlin was the Western threat to use force against the Soviet Union, and that meant increasingly a threat to use nuclear weapons.
Khrushchev was bringing the Berlin crisis to a head. He delivered an ultimatum that was going to spring in November of '62. And the Americans were puzzled, like, why does he think he's going to prevail on this in November? And this puzzle had been bothering them for a while. Here's a situation where 2 million Berliners, dependent on America, to whom America has pledged their support, are behind the Iron Curtain surrounded by Soviet soldiers because their conventional forces can't equal the Soviet forces on the scene. The only way the Americans can protect Berlin against a Soviet attack is by threatening to use nuclear weapons if the Soviets overran Berlin. That means that the Americans had to convince the Soviets that this was a credible threat, that we were prepared to use our nuclear weapons if necessary. So Khrushchev thought that he had to have nuclear weapons enough to convince the Americans that this escalation was insane. He had to be able to retaliate.
At that time, Americans have the huge superiority in the nuclear weapons. So my father created this policy of bluffing or threatening when he told, we're producing missiles like sausages, we have this and this and this, and he pressed opposite side to show the strength that really created so-called missile race on American side, because in Soviet Union it was no missile race, because we did what we could do with race or without race.
The major issue facing the United States at the time was the so-called bomber gap, that the Soviets were far ahead of us in the production and deployment of bombers.
This is our B-47, the jet medium-range bomber that became the dependable workhorse of Strategic Air Command.
Eisenhower was a great one for using reconnaissance, and we began to gather information about the capabilities of the Soviet Union. We flew over the main Soviet bases, we could count the bombers, and within 3 months we could go to President Eisenhower and say, Mr. President, there's no bomber gap. This is the U-2. The first mission was flown over the Soviet Union in July 4th, 1956.
It was just such specific type of the celebration of the Independence Day. And of course it was humiliation to my father, to the country, and he waited when we will shot the U-2. It happened on the May Day 1960. So when U-2 was shot, my father took the revenge, and he thought, I will play this cat and mouse game, and then we will solve this problem and we'll start to talk with the American president. It's unclear why Americans sent the U-2 just on this day, but still my father decided that he will fly to Paris one day before the summit, thinking that if the American want, he will meet with president. And as I know from the history, President Eisenhower was ready. My father did not receive any invitation to meet. But he told that we have time and history on our side. We can wait, and I will negotiate with the new American president. It will be just elected the same 1960.
Now the issue in the 1960 campaign between Nixon and Kennedy was Cuba and the missile gap. When Kennedy was elected, he was told that there was no missile gap.
Well, there was a radical change in our information on Soviet strategic forces right in that period, 1961, 62, as a result of using Earth satellites for intelligence collection.
Through the satellite system, we could precisely count the number of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile systems. And at that particular time, there was only 15. The United States at the time had over 400 ICBMs.
The missile gap was rapidly becoming a missile gap in our favor.
And because it was fear, my father's fear that if Americans will know how weak we are, it can provoke them to start the war.
It was decided by the President and Rusk and McNamara that a statement should be made to let the Russians know that we had strategic military forces which were so strong that even if they were struck by a Soviet surprise attack, would be able to retaliate with a strong or stronger response. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Roswell Gilpatrick, made a speech in October 1961. This was a way of signaling not only that there was such a new understanding of the strategic balance, it also meant that Khrushchev and his colleagues in the Soviet political and military leadership had to understand no longer could they rely on the secrecy that they had always prized as a way of not only covering up their strengths but also their weaknesses. What we didn't appreciate sufficiently was that precisely this demonstration of our awareness of Soviet weakness would be a strong incentive for them to try to overcome this in some way.
And his intercontinental missiles back in the Soviet Union weren't really any good. He had very good medium and intermediate range missiles, but they couldn't reach the United States homeland from Europe, hence Cuba.
There were always sort of events down there that suggested there was dissent, that there was dissatisfaction, and there were some political maneuverings to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. Most of them turned out to be nothing. But then we got some wind that there was a serious threat. It was in the late 1958, I believe. There was a revolution brewing. New Year's Eve, I guess it was, the next day was 1959. About 5 o'clock in the morning, we started to hear gunshots and activity outside, and we looked out the window, and this was now daylight, so we could see that there were people tearing apart the parking meters and setting little fires, and this thing escalated. And about a week later, Castro arrived in town from Oriente province, the other part of the island. When Castro first came in, he was a hero.
Before, in the beginning, it was strong feeling on Soviet leadership that he is one more Central American dictator that fully dependent from CIA and the United States.
When he came here in '59, he was sort of almost heroic.
Then it turned out that Castro preferred an association with the Soviet Union, was surrounded by communists.
And the bridge began to widen between him and the United States.
You know this famous American expression, he is the son of the beach, but he is our son of the beach. Castro became our son of the beach.
And then the Soviets, I think, started to send in all sorts of aid to Castro. What was it, $1 million a day or something for a while? The Castro government became largely reliant on this aid from the Soviet Union to sustain its economy.
Soviet Union tried to help him with arms.
Maybe he felt beleaguered by the U.S. There was constant threat. We certainly were an enemy 90 miles away. So naturally, these people would go for help wherever they could get it.
Castro then was thought to be extremely dangerous.
The Eisenhower administration had decided that it would try to unseat him, and the Kennedy administration again inherited a plan for a covert operation, for a paramilitary operation, which turned out to be at the Bay of Pigs.
The Bay of Pigs was an operation to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles trained by the CIA.
The CIA had a training camp for these, I think there were 2,000 Cubans who ultimately formed this brigade.
They would either defeat Castro's forces directly or more likely trigger a nationwide uprising that would bring Castro down.
This is the beginning of Castro. 90% of Cubans were pro-Castro. The notion that the island would rise against Castro for a bunch of Miami Cubans run by CIA was ludicrous.
When Kennedy came into power, the plans for the invasion of the Bay of Pigs were on the drawing board.
But the Eisenhower administration hadn't made a firm decision about whether to go forward with them, and Eisenhower hadn't really engaged the issue personally.
And within days, Kennedy, who should have read the fine print, he signed off on it without realizing the true implications, the impact.
The plan had not been given serious military scrutiny, and there were actually a lot of problems with the plan that had been identified as the Kennedy people came in. The intelligence people papered over some of those problems with the plan, did not fully share with Kennedy their own doubts and qualms about the plan, and then increasingly rationalized away those flaws.
The Cubans in Miami were pretty open about talking about attacking Castro and sailing over to Cuba from Central America. And everybody knew that was happening. As a matter of fact, one of the reporters, Tad Schultz, who was then with the New York Times and knew a lot more about this story than I did, than most people did, came back to Washington and in speaking to some officials said, if you guys think you're keeping any secret about this brigade, you're very sadly mistaken.
Which, by the way, you might say that if I was getting that information, Castro was getting that information.
Some of the people involved, I think, clearly half hoping that if things went wrong, Kennedy would bail it out by sending the American military into Cuba, which Kennedy had no intention of doing.
Kennedy made a fateful decision not to use American air power to cover that invasion. Could that have succeeded if the United States had thrown forces in? Kennedy feared that that might trigger a Soviet response.
And so the whole thing turned out to be a gigantic first-class fiasco in April of '61.
1961, I guess, was the Bay of Pigs, and 1962 was the missile crisis, and there was a thread.
After the Bay of Pigs, the Cubans went into the CIA and got some of the papers, and one of the papers said, if by October 12th we have not gotten him out of power, we have to do something very important.
Castro, however, was now mortally afraid that the United States would try again. Why not? Little Cuba versus this behemoth of the North?
My father had to think how he can defend the Cuba to prevent the American invasion.
And he did feel, I think, that the Soviet Union had every right to put missiles in Cuba. The United States had done the same thing in other countries. So he felt that it was a justifiable action that he was taking, and it would help to serve several purposes for the Soviet Union and for himself as its leader.
Castro had very different understanding of everything. He thought that he need no defense. He is strong enough just to defeat any invader, including United States. It was one of the topic of the discussion between Castro and my father. My father told, you young man, you don't understand. What does it mean, all these things?
Starting in about February of 1962, the Soviets began sending shipload after shipload of military equipment to Cuba. And it was very carefully watched, not only by the CIA, but also by the U.S. Navy. The Soviets began to crate the more sensitive objects that they were sending to Cuba. We could precisely measure those crates and then determine what was in them. In that crate is a Komar guided missile patrol boat.
It was clear that it will be kept in secret. And you know that on the ships they was covered everything with the agriculture machines, and all these missiles were deep inside the ships, so you could see nothing, and it was many other requirements to keep it secret.
The Soviets have stretched tarpaulin over these missiles, and then they have taken mud or paint and disruptively smeared it across these tarpaulins in order to break up the natural outline of the cylindrical object that lies beneath.
Soviet military thought that when the missile will be erected, they will look like a palm tree. I still don't understand why they think that it is this, but they told maybe they will cover there with the leaves of the top. In any military operation. You make some mistake and then it was discovered.
The Soviets had been giving a lot of military supplies to Cuba in the summer of 1962. We saw that.
We are here vested there, and we have to oppose any their aggression against our state.
The Kennedy administration made a deliberate decision that if all they were doing was helping the Cubans defend themselves, they were going to tolerate that, but no more. They drew a line, publicly and privately, that says don't put nuclear weapons, i.e. missiles, in Cuba, or the gravest consequences would arise. And the Soviets promised Kennedy, publicly and privately, that they wouldn't cross that line.
On October 14, a recon plane returns with the first hard photographic evidence indicating the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba.
While searching the photography in Cuba, we discovered these are surface-to-air missile sites. Now, they could fire from the ground and strike a U-2.
Color photography was employed with great success over these locations in Cuba.
And it was obvious from the way they were deploying them that it was going to be a barrier defense, that they didn't want any airplane coming into the Cuban airspace.
One of the reasons that we incorrectly estimated that they probably would not put the missiles in Cuba is that they had a record of being fairly cautious in offensive actions. They would try to advance their position, but if they ran into unexpected opposition and difficulty and so on, then they would desist.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the historic photograph of the Cuban crisis. It was acquired with a high-altitude aircraft in the early morning hours of 14 October 1962.
When this was shown to President Kennedy, he got quite angry. In the meantime, we get word that there is a trapezoidal area in which the Cubans are being moved out and the Russians are being moved in.
This is the place where the missile was kept. No doubt the Soviets were making every effort to achieve an operational capability at these sites as quickly as possible.
The idea to send the missiles to Cuba, it was pure my father's idea.
Indeed, he was the principal advocate of putting the missiles into Cuba, and he brought his colleagues along. A couple of them did raise some objections at the beginning.
Some of members of Politburo signed the decision, but did not write yes or no. So he sent this man back and told, I will call them, they will not forget to write their yes. And then it was yes, all of them. It was an unanimous decision.
Kennedy very quickly added up that those missiles in Cuba could then be used not only to change the balance of power and show that the Americans were being humiliated more generally, but could be used by the Soviets to achieve a victory for them in the Berlin crisis. And he worries aloud about this frequently. If I act against Cuba, they'll retaliate against Berlin.
For some people in the military, it was not a Berlin crisis. From their standpoint, the Soviet emplacement of missiles in Cuba provided an opportunity to act against Cuba. General LeMay was quite clear in his statements to Kennedy that he did not believe anything was going to happen in Berlin, that he thought that there was an opportunity to get rid of Castro. That was a difference in perspective on what the crisis was about. Kennedy remembered his experience in the Bay of Pigs affair.
How he ought to do national security decision-making a little better, how he ought to be a little bit more careful about whose advice he accepts.
And felt that he had been misled because he'd only heard the people who were supposed to be in the room. He wanted a wide variety of people, so he brought in people who had reach into different areas.
Very early morning of October 16th, I was in touch with Kennedy, and he said, I don't want you to talk to the press at all about this right now. We don't want the Soviet Union to understand exactly what we're doing until we do it. When I got to Chicago, there were some journalists who were starting to understand that the United States was sending troops into Cuba.
We knew that there was a lot of sensitive stuff here. I mean, the troop movements themselves. I don't know that people held anything much back because we didn't get much that we could attribute to any government official.
There was not an enormous amount of information coming out of the government. Of course, typically at crisis times, you get perhaps less than you might normally get.
Well, I do think that a lot of press secretaries deliberately try not to know what's really going on for fear of revealing classified information at a very tension-ridden time.
We could sort of tell by their words in the 2 times they would talk to us, you know, they were buttoned up pretty tightly. You could tell by their manner that this was serious stuff.
Now, over the weekend, Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, realized something was going on. He'd had to make up a story that the president had to come back to Washington because of a cold. He's a smart guy, so he understood something was up that was very, very important.
He and I went to the plane and took off, and it was about half of the way to the flight that I suddenly went in with Kennedy and said, listen, you're not sick, what the hell are you doing?
And for the first time, really, in a major sense, they wouldn't tell him.
It's October the 20th, and they hold a meeting up in the living quarters in the White House. Mr. Lundahl presents the information that all of the targets in the United States now could be struck from Cuba, and the military go ballistic. Adlai Stevenson thought that he could handle it all, that he would do all the negotiating at the United Nations, even giving up Guantanamo. Well, this brought on the ire of both Bobby and McCone and the military.
Adlai Stevenson was later labeled as the lead advocate of this, and he did support it, but McNamara was the lead advocate.
Stevenson was really attacked, and that's when Bobby said, we've got to either replace him or put some starch on the son of a bitch's back.
Since the president had positioned the United States on the line, in effect, in insisting earlier that no offensive weapons would be allowed in Cuba, we had to make good on that position, on that pledge.
No doubt about it, the military wanted to take the missiles out by bombing them.
Some of the Air Force generals were much more eager to go ahead with what would have been a successful military campaign, and this is because they thought that the Soviets would hold back from any military action elsewhere.
The people who were pushing to move toward an invasion of Cuba did not believe that they were pushing for a nuclear war. They didn't believe a nuclear war was going to happen. And when you get that near confrontation with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you can hear Kennedy almost saying, I can understand the way they feel. If I were sitting on the other side and I wore all those medals and had stars on my shoulder, I might well take that position.
The military knew that the United States had strategic superiority. They also knew that Khrushchev would not put the missiles in with the idea that they would fail.
My father was the same type leader as any others, as Americans. He didn't want the war, but he told, if you will press us, they will press us in the corner. When they start, we will respond.
There is certainly evidence that would indicate that local Soviet commanders might have had other ideas. They might not have been as sophisticated as Khrushchev was in his thinking about what might happen.
All of the SA-2 equipment was under the Soviet control, and it was a Soviet commander that ordered the SA-2 to fire. And I think he did it without Moscow's permission. And that came damn close to starting the war right there. There were so many incidents here that could have rapidly escalated, and Kennedy always went back to the guns of August.
If you look at the history of this century, where World War I really came through a series of misjudgments of the intentions of others, certainly World War II, Korea, when you look at all those misjudgments which brought on war, and you put the nuclear equation into that struggle, that's what makes this, as I said before, such a dangerous time, and that we must proceed with the firmness and also with the best information we can get, and also with care.
He's constantly asking, why is Khrushchev doing this? And he's speculating about why he's doing it in a very analytic way.
I know that my father understood how dangerous it is, and I think that American presidents also understood this. Would they not understand? Maybe we could not speak now.
Kennedy then, along with Nikita Khrushchev, had the power to begin World War III. And most people, there were some exceptions, but most people thought during that time that once a nuclear exchange began, it could not be contained.
So here's Kennedy's in a terrible dilemma. If he does too little, he emboldens Khrushchev to bring the Berlin nuclear crisis to a terrible climax, and he's accused by everyone of being an appeaser like his father.
When President Kennedy's father was ambassador to Britain, he recommended to Neville Chamberlain that he agree to Hitler's proposal to annex part of Czechoslovakia. This was a seminal event in the creation of President Kennedy. It was a family shame. It lingered over him.
So you can imagine that John Kennedy felt a special concern that no one be able to brand him as appeasing the Russians in a situation where they were clearly making a provocative step.
With support pouring in from the free world, President Kennedy signs the quarantine order.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Forces under my command, that is to say under the command of the President, are ordered to interdict, subject to certain instructions contained in the proclamation, the delivery of offensive weapons and associated material to Cuba.
Remember that Kennedy's speech was heard in Moscow for the first time, I think, at about 5 a.m. Tuesday morning. He spoke Monday night. On Wednesday, you began to get the drift. The drift was, let's go to the UN. Let's find a way out of this.
I don't think that all this discussion in the UN attract too much attention in the Soviet Union. For the leaders, it was nothing more. Americans know that missiles there, and the Soviet ambassador had something to answer, and he answered not in the worst way in this situation. So
now there's exchanges of messages between Khrushchev and Kennedy.
During that time, from September of 1961 till the time that Kennedy was assassinated, 45 letters back and forth, and 5 were during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And here they exchange letters every day. I think it is the most significant part of this crisis. I think it's one of the most important difference between Cuban Missiles Crisis and all other crises. That means that both leaders trusted each other. They trusted that sooner or later they will find the solution.
October the 27th, all 24 missile sites were operational. The erectors were on the pads. Nearby was the missile-ready tents with the missiles in them. All that was needed was that the missile could be moved out and put on the erector, and 4 to 6 hours could be striking the United States.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things our own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
In the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, there was this kind of solemnity and this sort of grim feel almost.
I think it's gone beyond the stage of whether or not we support the president or we don't support him, where it's way past that.
Just that overall atmosphere of extreme concern, wanting to do as much as possible to find out what might be going on. There was not an enormous, obviously, amount of information coming out of the government.
He's not portrayed very much in the movie, but a career diplomat named Llewellyn Thompson emerges in the tapes as a very important figure. This is one of those all too rare cases where the advice of a veteran diplomat who knows the other side well really paid off, and Kennedy knew how to draw out that advice.
What was important, that my father trusted ambassador, that he will send to Washington, D.C. what he said, not his impression. And the second was maybe more important Cuban Missiles Crisis. Llewellyn Thompson had very good and correct understanding of nature of my father, of his real intentions, and of his not decision-making, but decision-thinking.
I think that Kennedy, he was a superb politician also. He intuitively understood that Khrushchev needed some mechanism for withdrawal, and Kennedy provided it by never seeking to rub it in.
The military were advising that the element of surprise was being dissipated.
My father knew that in Cuba, not only strategic nuclear weapons that most will not be used, but technical nuclear weapons, maybe about 60 or 70 of them, that can be used if an American invaded. Not because it will be order from Moscow, but it was no satellite at that time, no communication with Moscow, and each military trained to use all their strengths to accomplish their goal. The goal was to defend the island.
If war occurred, the first thing was that the Strategic Air Command bombers would be on their way. We had at that time about 400 ICBMs. We had Polaris submarines at sea. We had 60 Thor missiles in England, 30 Jupiters in Italy, and 15 in Turkey. We had tactical aviation in Germany, Korea, and Japan, Okinawa. So there would just be a raining of bombs and missiles on their way.
You know what was behind his calculation? European or Russian way of thinking. All our history we had enemies on our borders. All the history our territory was accessible to their weapons.
The U.S. ringed the Soviet Union, not just our underwater or our air capacity, but with missiles in Turkey, right on its border. Soviet Union didn't have any missiles that close.
Americans lived protected by two oceans. So they had never enemies on their borders as we had. And for their way of thinking was, to the public way of thinking, that if you have the weapon, these ugly Russians, these Khrushchev, will launch them the first possibility destroy New York. And it was a reaction which created very different situation and for my father and to President Kennedy, because Americans was ready to die, but to kick out all these weapons, and both sides had to decide what to do.
On the one hand, he's always trying to be tough. He wants to make it clear because it's terribly important that Khrushchev understand that he's serious about it. But at the same time, he more than anyone else seems to be conscious that it is important not to cross the line, that the moment at which a Russian gets killed or an American gets killed, the issue is going to become different. So he wants to be tough, but he also wants to wait till the last possible moment for any blood to be shed.
It was psychological American crisis.
So here was this young president, still thought by lots of people to be wet behind the ears, who had to make these decisions for one of the great superpowers.
To my father was the idea how he can calm it down and reach his goal to have the assurance that there will be no invasion in Cuba. And to American president, it was also not a very easy decision how they can prevent the invasion, not losing the face and not to be impeached.
The Russians caved. They did something adventurous, typically Khrushchev in spirit, but typically Khrushchev also in outcome, in that he looked down the road. He did not want war. He wanted the Soviet Union to be respected. He wanted it to be honored. He wanted it to be seen as one of the great powers in the world. And he wanted it to be seen as a great power, not just on the basis of its military strength, but because it did extraordinary things.
Castro had not understood at the time that the Soviet strategic position was relatively so weak. So he thought that the Soviet Union was in a stronger position and should have been able to act tougher than it did.
When I did my broadcast, which was to allow the Russian to go through to the United States, then to translate it, and then to say, in my opinion, the Russians have just caved. Those were the words I used. President Kennedy heard that, got a message through to my bureau chief in Washington, who was David Schoenbrunn at the time, no longer with us, that at the first commercial, to get the word to me in Moscow, that we don't like phraseology like caved. Don't say things like that.
After the agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy that the missiles would be removed, there remained a considerable dispute for a couple weeks as to just what offensive weapons were involved and needed to be withdrawn. Everyone understood that this included the long-range missiles.
In recent days, questions have been raised in the press and elsewhere regarding the presence of offensive weapon systems in Cuba. I believe beyond any reasonable doubt that all such weapon systems have been removed from the island and none have been reintroduced. We have recorded the entry of Soviet offensive weapon systems into Cuba, and we've recorded their removal.
On the other hand, there were others who wanted to take advantage of our position of strength and say, well, let's get them to take everything out. Take out fighter planes, take out all the Soviet military personnel and weapons.
I stand on my statement that there's 10 times as much military equipment there now, and in addition to this, the Soviet troops are digging in. These combat troops are building semi-permanent or permanent barracks. It's patently absurd, it seems to me, to believe the Russians and other communists are in Cuba because they're on the defensive, that they've established a firm military base and are digging into it to defend the Cuban people.
We cannot base the issue of war and peace on a rumor or report, which is not substantiated, or which some member of Congress refuses to tell us where he heard it. This issue involves a very definitely war and peace, and when you talk about the presence of offensive weapons there, if they are there, I think the Soviet Union is aware, and Cuba is aware, that we would be back where we were in October, but in a far more concentrated way.
Some of us argued for insisting that the bombers be withdrawn. The President, after some hesitation, did take that position, and Khrushchev agreed to remove them.
I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave. Inasmuch as this goes a long way towards reducing the danger which faced this hemisphere 4 weeks ago, I have this afternoon instructed the Secretary of Defense to lift our naval quarantine. We will not, of course, abandon the political, economic, and other efforts of this hemisphere to halt subversion from Cuba, nor our purpose and hope that the Cuban people shall someday be truly free. But these policies are very different from any intent to launch a military invasion of the island. May I add this final thought? In this week of Thanksgiving, there is much for which we can be grateful. As we look back to where we stood only 4 weeks ago, the unity of this hemisphere, the support of our allies, and the calm determination of the American people. These qualities may be tested many more times in this decade, but we have increased reason to be confident that those qualities will continue to serve the cause of freedom with distinction in the years to come.